What if I told you that the history textbooks we all grew up with are basically collections of fan fiction, ranging from brilliant PR stunts by kings to fake news that went viral long before the internet existed? Today, we're going to debunk 30 of the dumbest, strangest, and most shockingly persistent myths in history. Brace yourselves, this is going to hurt. Fact 1. The Great Wall of China, the cosmic hoax. Let's start with a big one. You've been told 1,000 times that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from the moon. What a beautiful thought. What a monument to human perseverance, visible from space. The only problem? It's a complete and utter astronomical lie. It's not visible from the moon. Hell, you can't even spot it from low Earth orbit with the naked eye. Astronauts are unanimous. You'd have a better chance of seeing a major highway. Think about it. The wall is incredibly long, but it's only about 6 meters wide. Trying to spot it from orbit is like trying to see a single human hair from 2 kilometers away. This myth was born long before space travel because it just sounded too cool to be fact-checked. And now it's stuck to us like gum on a shoe. Fact 2. Alligators in the New York sewers, the greatest horror movie never made. A classic piece of urban folklore that just won't go down the drain. The story goes that wealthy families bought baby alligators as pets, and when they grew too big, they simply flushed them down the toilet. These resilient reptiles not only survived, but thrived in the warm, dark sewers, evolving into giant, blind, albino monsters. It's a fantastic plot for a horror film. The only issue is there's zero proof. What would they even eat down there? An endless supply of lost wedding rings and mutant rats? Over decades of work, sanitation crews have never found a single colony of giant, pale gators. And you just know they were probably hoping to find at least one, just to have a great story to tell at parties. Fact 3. The Illuminati, history's most overhyped startup. The all-seeing eye on the dollar bill. A secret society of global elites pulling the strings from a shadowy boardroom. They control wars, the economy, and maybe even your Wi-Fi signal. It's the ultimate conspiracy theory. And now for the hilarious truth. The Bavarian Illuminati did exist, and they were a total failure. Founded in 1776, it was a tiny society of Enlightenment-era intellectuals who wanted to promote reason and humanism. Their secret meetings likely involved arguing about Kant's philosophy while snacking on stale crackers. The all-powerful cabal supposedly ruling the world was, in reality, a short-lived book club for nerds that was shut down by the government within a decade. They couldn't even organize their activities beyond Bavaria, let alone take over the entire planet. Fact 4. St. Patrick, Ireland's greatest PR manager. Every March, the world celebrates St. Patrick, the legendary hero who drove all the snakes out of Ireland. It's a story of faith conquering evil, a miracle for the ages, except for one tiny, inconvenient detail. There were never any snakes in post-glacial Ireland. The island was separated from the mainland by water long before snakes could have slithered their way there after the Ice Age. So what's the deal? The story is a brilliant metaphor and a masterful PR move. The snakes were a symbol of the pagan beliefs that St. Patrick was eradicating, replacing them with Christianity. He was a true PR genius, turning a routine missionary trip into an epic battle against monsters. He didn't banish actual reptiles, he just performed a very effective and metaphorical fumigation of local beliefs. Measteim Fact 5. Absinthe. The Green Fairy. Art history's greatest hangover. The drink of cursed poets and artists, famous for inducing wild, vivid hallucinations and creative madness. It was banned for nearly a century due to its alleged psychotropic properties. This entire reputation is one giant, drunken lie. The myth was fueled by a brilliant smear campaign from French winemakers who were losing customers to the popular green spirit. Absinthe does contain thujone, but you would die from alcohol poisoning 10 times over before you felt any psychoactive effect. The artists weren't seeing amazing visions. They were just wasted, writing terrible poetry, and thinking it was brilliant. Fact 6. Suicidal Lemmings, Disney's cruelest fake news. This myth is just sad and bizarrely cruel. We've all seen the footage. Hordes of lemmings, driven by some mysterious suicidal instinct, marching in formation toward a cliff and plunging into the sea. It has become a metaphor for mindless conformity. But in reality, lemmings do not commit mass suicide. This myth was literally fabricated by the Walt Disney Company. For their 1958 documentary White Wilderness, the film crew couldn't get the shot they wanted. So what did they do? They bought a bunch of lemmings, brought them to a cliff overlooking a river, and then simply herded them off the edge with brooms. They staged a natural phenomenon by pushing animals to their deaths to win an Oscar. Fact 7. Diamonds, the greatest marketing scam in history. Get ready to hate your jewelry. The belief that diamonds are inherently rare and incredibly valuable is perhaps the most successful marketing lie of all time. Diamonds are not particularly rare. In fact, they are one of the more common gemstones. Their value was artificially inflated by one company, De Beers. In the 20th century, they created a global monopoly, hoarding diamonds to control supply and drive up prices. Then in the 1940s, they hired an ad agency that gave us the slogan, "A diamond is forever," and invented the modern tradition of the diamond engagement ring from scratch. They didn't sell a product. They sold an idea, and we are still paying for it. That sparkling stone isn't a symbol of eternal love. It's a symbol of marketing genius. Fact 8. Sherlock Holmes never said his most famous line. Picture Sherlock Holmes. He has just solved an impossibly complex case, turns to his loyal companion, and utters the immortal phrase, "Elementary, my dear Watson." It's the most famous quote associated with the character, yet he never once said it in any of Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. Holmes did say "elementary," and he did say, "my dear Watson." But the two were never combined. The phrase was popularized decades later in theater productions and early films. It became so famous that it was retroactively burned into our collective memory. It's the ultimate literary Mandela effect. Fact 9. The medieval flat earth. A lie to make our ancestors look stupid. The myth of the Dark Ages is so persistent that we still use the term to describe a time of ignorance. Central to this myth is the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages, from peasants to kings, believed the earth was flat. This is a lie invented to make people of the past seem foolish. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew perfectly well that the earth was a sphere. They had been reading Greek texts from scholars like Aristotle and Ptolemy for centuries. The real debate wasn't about the shape, but the size. The whole story of Columbus proving the earth was round was fabricated in the 19th century to paint him as a lone genius fighting against a superstitious and backward church. In reality, his critics weren't afraid he'd sail off the edge of the world. They correctly argued that his calculations were terrible and that the planet was much larger than he thought. Fact 10. The Titanic was never called unsinkable. The legend of the Titanic is the ultimate story of human hubris meeting a very large, very cold iceberg. Central to this legend is the claim that the White Star Line advertised the ship as unsinkable. It's the perfect ironic setup for a tragedy. But they never said that. This powerful label was attached mostly by the press after the disaster to make the story more dramatic and sell more newspapers. The company used much safer lawyer-approved language, calling the ship practically unsinkable. The difference is huge. It's like saying a phone is water-resistant, not waterproof. The media just dropped the word practically because the headline, "Unsinkable Ship Sinks," writes itself, and you never let the boring truth get in the way of a fantastic story? Fact 11. Cleopatra. A Hollywood deception. Hollywood sold us an image of Cleopatra as a stunning Egyptian queen, a siren who seduced powerful Romans with her otherworldly beauty. Time for a reality check. First, she wasn't Egyptian. She was the last ruler of a Greek dynasty that had ruled Egypt for centuries. She was about as Egyptian as pepperoni pizza is an ancient Roman dish. More importantly, all evidence suggests she was not a conventional beauty. Coins minted during her reign depict a woman with a large, hooked nose and a sharp chin. Her real superpower wasn't her looks, it was her brain. She spoke multiple languages, was a brilliant political strategist, and possessed such charisma that the two most powerful men in the world risked everything for her. Her weapon was her intellect, not her eyeliner. Fact 12. Newton and the Apple, a story for kindergarten. The story plays out like a cartoon. Isaac Newton is sitting under a tree, an apple falls, bonk, hits him right on the head, and, eureka, he instantly understands gravity. It's a simple, perfect origin story for a genius idea. Except the part about getting hit on the head was a later addition to make the tale more interesting. Newton himself said that he was simply looking out a window and saw an apple fall from a tree. The sight made him wonder why it fell straight down rather than sideways or up. This prompted his thinking about a universal force of attraction. The reality is far less comical. There was no funny bonk, no cry of ouch, just a quiet moment of observation that led to one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history. Turns out genius requires attention to detail, not a concussion. Fact 13. The Iron Maiden. A horror prop? It's the nightmare of every metalhead and medieval prisoner. A terrifying, human-shaped sarcophagus lined with sharp spikes designed to slowly impale its victim. It's the calling card of medieval cruelty, except it's a complete fake. There is zero historical evidence of this device being used in the Middle Ages. In fact, it was fabricated in the late 1700s, likely as a gruesome art object for a museum to shock and entertain visitors. It was basically a prop from a cheap haunted house. The Middle Ages had plenty of genuinely horrific torture methods. They didn't need this tacky, Hollywood-style contraption that someone invented for kicks centuries later. Fact 14. Baseball. Invented to annoy the British. Ask an American who invented baseball, and you'll likely hear the name Abner Doubleday, a heroic Civil War general. It's a beautiful all-American origin story and a 100% patriotic fabrication. The myth was created by a special commission in 1907 tasked with finding a purely American inventor for the national pastime to deny its obvious roots in the English game of rounders. They just picked a famous dead guy and pinned it on him. Doubleday himself never mentioned inventing baseball. His diaries were filled with military matters, not thoughts on bats and bases. America literally invented an inventor to win a cultural argument with the British. Fact 15. General Tso's chicken, a dish General Tso never tasted. This sweet, spicy, deep-fried dish is a staple of every American Chinese restaurant menu. It's supposed to be an authentic dish from China's Hunan province. In reality, it's about as Chinese as a cheeseburger. The dish was invented in the 1970s by a chef in New York City who wanted to create something that would appeal to the American palate, which apparently means deep frying it and covering it in a sweet, sticky sauce. If you go to Hunan province and ask for General Tso's chicken, they will look at you like you're insane. The real General Tso probably ate simple regional food his entire life and would be utterly bewildered to learn that his legacy in America is a plate of sticky, battered chicken nuggets. Fact 16. The Trojan Horse, history's greatest spoiler. The Trojan horse is one of the greatest military deceptions in history. The Greeks built a giant wooden horse, hide soldiers inside, and leave it as a gift. The Trojans, showing shocking short-sightedness, wheel it into their city and celebrate their victory, only to be slaughtered in their sleep. It's a brilliant story, except it was almost certainly a metaphor, not a literal horse. Most historians believe the horse was likely a poetic description of a siege engine, like a battering ram, that finally broke through the gates. Or perhaps it was an earthquake, sent by the horse god Poseidon. It's just that the story from the epic poem sounds a lot cooler than they broke the door down with a big log. Fact 17. The 300 Spartans and their 7,000 friends. The story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae is the ultimate tale of heroism. 300 chiseled warriors bravely holding off a million-man Persian army. It's a foundational myth of Western civilization. However, the story conveniently leaves out a few key details, namely the other 7,000 Greeks who were also there. The Spartans were not alone. They were part of a larger Greek alliance. While the 300 Spartans were undoubtedly the elite core of the defense, they had a massive amount of backup. The narrative was later simplified to focus on the Spartans because, let's be honest, 7,300 Greeks fight valiantly doesn't have the same Hollywood ring to it as 300. Fact 18. The Mozart Effect, a genius scam for parents. In the 1990s, the Mozart effect swept the world. The idea was simple and seductive. Play Mozart for your baby, and they'll become smarter. Parents rushed to buy CDs, hoping to turn their toddlers into little geniuses. This entire craze was based on a gross misinterpretation of a single small study from 1993. The study didn't even involve infants. It was conducted on college students and only found a temporary 10-minute improvement in their spatial reasoning skills after listening to a Mozart sonata. That's it. No evidence of a long-term boost in overall IQ, and it had nothing to do with infant brain development. A multi-million-dollar industry was born from this one flimsy fact, proving that the fastest way to sell something is to tell parents it will make their kids smarter. Fact 19. The perpetual motion machine, powered by an old man. In the early 1800s, an inventor named Charles Redheffer wowed America with his incredible creation, a perpetual motion machine. This complex device could allegedly run forever without an external power source. A skeptical engineer, Robert Fulton, noticed something was off. The gears were moving unevenly, as if turned by hand. He exposed the fraud by breaking away a few boards and revealing the power source. A tired old man in an upstairs room, sitting on a stool, turning a crank with one hand and eating a piece of bread with the other. It wasn't a perpetual motion machine, it was just an underpaid worker. Fact 20. Ancient statues were as bright as a Christmas tree. When we think of Greek and Roman art, we picture pristine, elegant white marble statues. Gods and heroes look pure, timeless, and, frankly, a little boring. This image is a complete accident of history. In reality, these statues were originally painted in incredibly bright, gaudy, and sometimes tacky colors. We're talking about vibrant reds, blues, greens, and yellows covering every inch, with painted irises, eyelashes, and maybe even some tacky bronze accessories. The paint simply wore off over millennia. Renaissance artists who rediscovered these sculptures assumed they were meant to be monochrome, and the classical white aesthetic was born. The ancients weren't minimalists, they had the color palette of an 80s music video. Fact 21. Wild West duels were pure Hollywood fiction. Hollywood has drilled a clear image into our heads. The Wild West, a lawless land where showdowns between gunslingers in the middle of Main Street were a common occurrence. Two grim-faced men, a dusty road, a tumbleweed, and a clock striking high noon. It's a fantastically cool image, but it's almost entirely fabricated. Organized high noon duels were incredibly rare. Most frontier towns actually had strict gun control, often requiring visitors to check their revolvers at the sheriff's office. Violent death was more likely to come from a drunken brawl in a saloon or a back alley ambush, not an honorable duel. The romanticized image of the gunslinger was created by dime novels and then cemented by Hollywood because it's far more entertaining than the reality of cattle rustling and land disputes. Fact 22. The cowboy wasn't just Clint Eastwood. When you picture a cowboy, you probably see a rugged white guy like John Wayne. This image is a classic example of Hollywood whitewashing history. The reality of the American West was far more diverse. Historians estimate that up to 25% of all cowboys during the Great Cattle Drives of the late 19th century were African American. Many were former slaves who possessed incredible skills with horses and cattle. Furthermore, a huge number of cowboys were Mexican vaqueros, from whom the entire American cowboy tradition, from terminology to clothing and techniques, was essentially borrowed. The iconic American cowboy wasn't monochromatic. He was a multicultural figure whose true history has been erased from popular culture. Fact 23. Emperor Nero and his fiery concert. Legend has it that as Rome burned in 64 AD, the cruel Emperor Nero stood on his palace balcony and heartlessly played the fiddle. It's the perfect image of a leader detached from his people's suffering. This is a brilliant piece of slander, but it's impossible for two reasons. First, the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. It wouldn't appear for another 1,000 years. If he played anything, it was a lyre, which sounds far less dramatic. Second, historical accounts like that of Tacitus state that Nero was 50 kilometers out of town when the fire started. He rushed back to Rome to organize relief efforts, spending his own funds on food and shelter for the homeless. The entire story was likely dirty propaganda spread by his political enemies. Fact 24. The Middle Ages weren't an era of total filth. The Middle Ages have a reputation for being an era of filth and stench, where people went their entire lives without bathing. We imagine peasants caked in dried mud and nobles dousing themselves in perfume to mask the smell. While their hygiene standards certainly weren't modern, this is a wild exaggeration. People bathed. Most towns had public bathhouses, and bathing was a common social ritual until plague outbreaks made people wary of them. People used soap made from animal fat and ash and understood the need to wash their hands and faces. They weren't taking daily showers with scented body wash, but they also weren't the walking biohazards we imagined them to be. Fact 25. The 30-year average lifespan. A blatant statistical lie. We've all heard the grim figure. The average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was only 30 years. This paints a picture of a brutal world where everyone was an old-timer by their late 20s. But this number is a classic example of misleading statistics. The average was dragged down by an incredibly high infant mortality rate. A huge number of children died before their first birthday. If you managed to survive childhood and make it to 20, your chances of living to 60 or even 70 were actually quite good, provided you weren't killed in a war or died from an infected tooth. The world wasn't full of teenagers having a midlife crisis. It was just an extremely dangerous place to be a baby. Fact 26. The Spanish Inquisition was bad, but not the worst. The Spanish Inquisition has a reputation as the most terrifying organization in history, synonymous with sadistic torture and mass executions. But its cruelty has been wildly exaggerated, mostly by Protestant propaganda from rival nations like England. In fact, the Inquisition's own rules limited torture sessions and required a doctor to be present. The secular courts of the time were often far more brutal, using torture more frequently and with less regulation. It's strange to say, but if you were accused of heresy in the 15th century, you were probably better off in the hands of the church than the state. Fact 27. The Curse of the Pharaohs, a newspaper invention. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he unleashed not only treasures but also a media frenzy about the curse of the pharaohs. The legend claimed that anyone who disturbed the young king's eternal rest was doomed to a mysterious and horrible death. The myth gained traction when the expedition's sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, died a few months later from an infected mosquito bite. The newspapers went wild, but when you look at the numbers, it's complete nonsense. A study found that the death rate among the expedition members was perfectly normal. Howard Carter himself, the man who first broke the seal, lived for another 17 years. The curse wasn't real. It was a fantastic story cooked up by journalists to sell papers. Fact 28. A Message to Garcia. Corporate propaganda written in an hour. This short 1899 essay became a corporate and military Bible for a century. It tells the story of a heroic American soldier who, without asking a single question, delivers a message to a Cuban rebel leader. It was held up as the ultimate example of initiative. The problem is the heroic core of the story is mostly made up. The author, Elbert Hubbard, wrote the piece in 1 hour to fill empty space in his magazine. He essentially invented a tool of corporate propaganda that deified unquestioning obedience, and generations of bosses have been handing it to their employees ever since. Fact 29. Ponce de Leon and his non-existent Fountain of Youth. The Spanish conquistador. Ponce de Leon is forever linked to an obsessive search for the Fountain of Youth, a classic story of a fool chasing a dream through the swamps of Florida. But this entire story was attributed to him after his death. Ponce de Leon's own records contain not a single mention of the fountain. He was in Florida for the same reasons as all the other conquistadors, to find gold, claim land for Spain, and maybe convert a few natives. The fountain story was added decades later by rival historians to paint him as a gullible old fool. He was a ruthless colonizer, not a guy looking for a magic spa treatment. Then Fact 30. The Priory of Sion, the 20th century's greatest hoax. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code introduced millions to the Priory of Sion, a secret society that had guarded the bloodline of Jesus Christ for centuries. The book presents it as a real, ancient organization. It is without a doubt one of the greatest historical hoaxes of the 20th century. The Priory of Sion was actually invented in 1956. Not 1056, but 1956. It was created by a French con man named Pierre Plantard, who desperately wanted to be a descendant of French kings. He forged a pile of documents, planted them in France's National Library, and tricked several authors into writing books about his fictional secret society. It was a complete fantasy that Dan Brown then turned into a global bestseller. So there you have it. History is basically a group project where half the team lied and the other half didn't bother to check the facts. Which of these false stories would you keep around just because it's more fun? Let me know in the comments. And if your brain feels a little betrayed but thoroughly entertained, hit that like button and subscribe.